A massive cruise ship, as long as 3 football fields lined up end to end, carrying more than 4,000 people, hit something in the dark, just a few hundred feet from the coast of a small Italian island. Within hours, it's lying on its side, in shallow water, half sunk, lights still on inside, food still sitting on the tables in the dining room. It stayed exactly like that for 2.5 years. Tourists took photos of it from the beach. It cost $570 million to build. By the time it was finally lifted out of the water and taken away, the cleanup alone had cost almost $800 million, nearly as much as building a brand new ship from scratch. How does something this big just get left behind like that? That's the story we're looking at today, and it's one of those stories that sounds almost too strange to be real, except every single part of it is fully documented, filmed, and confirmed by courts, engineers, and eyewitnesses. A ship that size simply doesn't disappear quietly. It sat there, tilted on its side, for years, in plain sight, while the whole world watched and wondered how something like this could have happened in the first place. It started as an ordinary week-long cruise. On the evening of January 13, 2012, the Costa Concordia left the port of Civitavecchia in Italy, heading out on a route through the Mediterranean Sea. On board were just over 4,200 people, more than 3,200 passengers, and around 1,000 crew members. It was meant to be a relaxing week at sea. Dinner, music, drinks by the pool, nothing out of the ordinary. Nobody on board that evening had any reason to think anything was wrong. The ship was less than 6 years old, one of the largest and most modern cruise ships ever built in Italy, and it had made this same kind of journey hundreds of times before without any trouble at all. But that night, the ship wasn't following its usual route. The captain, a man named Francesco Schettino, decided to steer the ship much closer to the small island of Giglio than the planned course allowed. It's sometimes called a sail by salute, basically sailing close to shore so people on the island can see the ship and wave, a kind of showy gesture that some captains like to do. It might sound harmless enough. Ships do pass close to land all the time, but close to Giglio, hidden just under the surface of the water, there were rocks that weren't clearly marked on the charts the crew was using. These charts weren't outdated by accident either. Investigators later found the depth information the crew relied on that night simply hadn't been updated to reflect the true underwater terrain near the island, a detail that would matter enormously once the legal blame started to be sorted out afterward. At around 9:45 that night, the Costa Concordia struck those rocks directly, and the impact tore open a gash in the side of the hull nearly 200 feet long. Water began pouring into the ship almost immediately. Within minutes, several of the ship's main compartments below deck, the very sections designed to keep the vessel afloat, even if one area flooded, were filling with seawater far faster than anyone on board had expected. The ship's own electrical systems, including the main generators, started failing as water reached them, which meant the crew wasn't just dealing with a flooding hull, they were also losing power in parts of the ship at the exact moment they needed it most. At first, most people on board had no idea how serious it was. Some felt the floor tilt slightly and assumed it was nothing more than rough water. Others heard a loud bang and simply carried on with their evening, waiting for someone in charge to explain what had happened. That's really where this story starts to go wrong, not with the rocks themselves, but with what happened, or rather didn't happen, in the hour that followed. Instead of quickly telling passengers the truth and starting an evacuation, the ship's crew gave confusing, delayed, and sometimes flat-out incorrect information over the loudspeakers. At one point, passengers were told the problem was simply an electrical fault, nothing to worry about, and that everything was under control. Meanwhile, the ship kept tilting further and further to one side. Furniture began sliding across rooms, glasses and plates crashed to the floor. People who had been calmly finishing dinner just minutes earlier were now struggling to stay on their feet as the floor beneath them turned into a slope, and still, no official order to abandon ship had been given. Passengers later described a strange, unsettling mix of panic and forced calm during those minutes. Some crew members trying their best to reassure people with information that simply wasn't true. Others visibly frightened themselves, but unsure what they were even allowed to tell the passengers around them. Families tried to stay together in the dark, narrow hallways, holding onto railings as the floor kept tilting further, while announcements over the loudspeakers continued suggesting everything was under control, even as the ship's angle made that claim harder and harder to believe with every passing minute. That order didn't actually come until around 65 minutes after the ship first hit the rocks. Think about that for a moment. More than an hour passed, with the ship visibly listing more and more before passengers were formally told to get to the lifeboats. By the time the evacuation order finally came, the ship was tilted so severely that many of the lifeboats on one side couldn't even be lowered properly into the water. Crew members had to improvise, guiding terrified passengers, including elderly guests, children, and people with disabilities, along steep, slanted hallways in the dark, trying to reach whichever lifeboats could still actually be used. And then came the moment that made this story famous all over the world, for all the wrong reasons. While hundreds of passengers and crew members were still trapped on board, still fighting to find a way off a ship that was now lying almost completely on its side, Captain Schettino was seen getting into a lifeboat and leaving. Under basic maritime law and simple common decency, a ship's captain is supposed to be the very last person to leave, only once everyone else is safely off. Schettino did the opposite. He left early, while people were still stuck on board, and later claimed in his own defense that he had fallen into the lifeboat by accident while it was being lowered. Almost nobody, including the Italian Coast Guard officer who spoke to him by radio that night in a now famous, furious phone call, believed that explanation for a second. In that call, which was later replayed on news broadcasts around the world, the Coast Guard officer, a man named Gregorio De Falco, repeatedly ordered Schettino to get back on board the ship and take charge of the evacuation properly. Schettino refused, offering excuse after excuse for why he couldn't return. At one especially tense moment, De Falco, clearly furious, told him bluntly to get back on board, using words that became instantly famous across Italy and eventually the rest of the world, a blunt, unmistakable demand that the man responsible for thousands of lives go back and actually do his job. By the time the chaotic overnight rescue operation was finally finished, the human cost of that hour and a half of confusion had become painfully clear. 32 people died that night, some drowned, some crushed as heavy objects slid across the tilting ship, some simply never found in time. Thousands more were pulled to safety in freezing, difficult conditions, some jumping into the dark water, others climbing down ropes and ladders along the side of a ship that was now lying almost flat against the rocks. It remains, to this day, the deadliest cruise ship disaster of the modern era. Among the victims were passengers who never even made it out of their cabins, elderly guests who couldn't move quickly enough down the steeply tilted hallways, and crew members who stayed behind trying to help others find their way to safety. Search and rescue teams continued combing through the flooded, half-submerged sections of the ship for weeks after the disaster, working in dangerous conditions to recover the bodies of those still missing, a grim, painstaking process that dragged the tragedy out far longer than the single chaotic night that caused it. You'd think that once everyone was finally off, the next step would simply be towing the wreck away and cleaning up. That's not even close to what actually happened. The Costa Concordia stayed exactly where it fell, half sunk, lying on its side against the rocks just off Giglio's coast, for 2.5 years. It wasn't hidden away somewhere out of sight either. It sat there in plain view, close enough to shore that tourists visiting the island could walk down to the beach and see the entire wreck for themselves. A genuinely strange, almost unreal sight, a 15-story cruise ship resting on its side like a beached whale, visible in every photo taken from that stretch of coastline for years afterward. Local residents grew strangely used to seeing it every single day, a permanent, rusting reminder of that night sitting just off their coastline. Some described feeling a kind of quiet sadness every time they looked out at it, a beautiful stretch of Mediterranean coastline now permanently associated, at least for a while, with tragedy rather than vacation photos. Environmental groups also raised the alarm during those years, worried about fuel and chemicals slowly leaking from the wreck into waters that were home to protected marine life, adding yet another layer of urgency to a cleanup that was already moving as carefully and as slowly as anyone could manage. The reason it took so long comes down to one simple but very difficult problem. Nobody had ever tried to move a ship this large, this badly damaged in one piece before. Engineers were terrified that if they tried to pull it off the rocks too quickly or in the wrong way, the hull could simply break apart, spilling fuel, debris, and possibly even human remains that hadn't yet been recovered into the surrounding sea, which happens to be a protected marine nature reserve. So instead of rushing, teams of engineers from around the world spent well over a year carefully planning an operation that had genuinely never been attempted at this scale before, running detailed computer simulations, testing smaller models, and consulting specialists from multiple countries who had experience with far smaller shipwrecks, but nothing remotely close to a vessel this size. Every part of the plan had to account for the possibility that something could still go wrong even after all that preparation, because nobody could say with total certainty how a hull this large, sitting at this angle, weakened by 2 years of exposure, would actually behave once real force was applied to it. What they eventually did was remarkable, even if most people have never heard the details. Engineers built an underwater platform directly beneath the wreck, essentially a giant steel shelf bolted into the seabed, strong enough to support the ship's full weight once it was finally pulled upright. Then, using a combination of massive cables, heavy machinery on shore, and enormous empty steel tanks welded onto the side of the hull, the team very slowly rotated the entire ship from lying on its side to standing fully upright again, a process called parbuckling. It took around 19 hours of continuous, painstaking work, watched live by news crews from around the world, to roll a ship the size of the Costa Concordia back onto its feet, all without it breaking apart in the process. To picture how difficult that actually was, imagine trying to gently roll a fallen skyscraper back upright without cracking a single window, except this skyscraper weighed tens of thousands of tons and had already spent nearly 2 years sitting half-submerged in salt water, slowly corroding. Engineers had to constantly monitor the stress building up across the hull throughout the entire operation, ready to stop everything at the first sign that the structure might be starting to buckle or tear under its own weight. Even after that, the ship still wasn't ready to be moved. More empty tanks had to be welded onto both sides of the hull and slowly filled with air to make the whole wreck buoyant enough to float again on its own. That process alone took nearly another year of preparation, careful, unglamorous work carried out mostly underwater by divers and engineers whose names most of the world will never know, even though their efforts were just as essential to this story as anything that happened on that first chaotic night back in January 2012. Finally, in the summer of 2014, more than 2.5 years after that first night in January 2012, the Costa Concordia was towed away from Giglio for good, moving at a painfully slow crawl, escorted by more than a dozen support vessels, crowds gathering along the coast to watch the strange, almost funeral-like procession on its final journey to a port near Genoa, where it would be taken apart piece by piece for scrap metal. Now here's where that number from the very beginning really starts to make sense. Building the Costa Concordia in the first place had cost around $570 million, an enormous sum, but a fairly typical price for one of the largest cruise ships of its time. Simply lifting the wreck back upright, keeping it stable, and towing it away for scrapping ended up costing nearly $800 million on its own, more than the original ship itself. Add in the years of legal costs, compensation paid to victims' families and injured passengers, and the total price tag connected to that single night climbs even higher. Some estimates covering the full scope of the disaster, including compensation, legal proceedings, lost revenue for the cruise line, and the salvage operation itself, have placed the overall cost well beyond $1 billion altogether, an almost unbelievable figure for a single evening's worth of decisions made too slowly, and one decision made far too selfishly. All of that money, all of that effort, all of those specialized engineers flown in from around the world, spent purely to clean up the consequences of one ship sailing too close to shore and one captain who never should have left it. If stories like this one interest you, the kind of real events most people never actually get the full picture of, go ahead and hit subscribe, because we put out a new one just like it every single week. The legal fallout that followed took years to fully play out. In 2015, Captain Schettino was put on trial and convicted on several serious charges, including manslaughter and causing the disaster through negligence. But there was one specific charge in that conviction that connects directly back to the title of this very story. He was also formally found guilty of abandoning ship, leaving his post and his passengers before the evacuation was complete. He was sentenced to 16 years in prison, and after exhausting every appeal available to him, that conviction was upheld by Italy's highest court in 2017. Several other crew members faced lesser charges and shorter sentences of their own, though none of them served significant prison time. Costa Cruises, the company that owned and operated the ship, also faced consequences, though nowhere near as severe as many survivors' and victims' families felt was fair. The company paid a relatively modest fine to close a separate corporate liability case, along with individual settlements to passengers that, for many, felt small compared to what they had actually gone through that night. For years afterward, opinion remained genuinely divided in Italy over whether Schettino alone deserved to carry the full weight of blame, or whether deeper problems within the company and the ship's overall safety culture had been allowed to walk away with far less scrutiny than the one man steering the ship that night. So when you really think about the full story, the title fits in more ways than one. This wasn't simply a $570 million ship that got abandoned at sea by circumstance, bad luck, or a genuine accident nobody could have prevented. It was a ship whose own captain was legally found to have abandoned it, leaving hundreds of passengers behind on a sinking vessel while he climbed into a lifeboat himself. The wreck then sat abandoned in place for 2.5 years, visible from the beach, too large and too complicated to simply tow away. And in the end, the final price tag for cleaning up that single decision came shockingly close to matching the cost of the entire ship in the first place. Sometimes, the most expensive lesson in an entire industry doesn't come from something breaking by accident. It comes from one person making a choice they were never supposed to make, close to shore, in the dark, on an ordinary Friday night that should have stayed completely ordinary. What makes this story stick with people, even more than a decade later, isn't really the size of the ship, or even the size of the final bill. It's how small the actual decision was that started it all. A slightly closer pass by an island, meant to look impressive for a few minutes, ended up costing 32 people their lives, cost a company close to $1 billion once everything was added up, and left one of the most modern cruise ships in the world sitting wrecked on its side for 2.5 years for anyone with a camera to photograph. Today, there's almost nothing left to see. The Costa Concordia was fully taken apart for scrap metal by 2017, its steel recycled and sold off in pieces, its name now remembered mostly through documentaries, court records, and that one furious phone call that still gets replayed whenever people talk about the disaster. The island of Giglio itself has slowly returned to being a quiet, ordinary tourist spot again, the rocks that caused so much damage still sitting exactly where they always were, hidden just beneath the surface of otherwise calm, blue Mediterranean water, waiting, as they always had been, for anyone who sails too close.